What happens when a late-night talk show host's ego becomes so inflated that he can't handle being the butt of a joke? Well, buckle up, because what went down between David Spade and Jimmy Kimmel during what was supposed to be a routine interview will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's so-called nice guys. This isn't your typical celebrity spat. This is a masterclass in how power corrupts and how one host's inability to laugh at himself led to one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because you're going to want to discuss this train wreck. The green room at Jimmy Kimmel Live was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy. David Spade sat in his chair, scrolling through his phone, mentally preparing for what he assumed would be another standard promotional appearance. He'd done Kimmel's show countless times before, always delivering his signature dry wit and self-deprecating humor that audiences loved. Tonight felt different, though. There was an unusual tension in the air that he couldn't quite put his finger on. A production assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Spade, you're up in 5 minutes." David nodded, straightening his jacket. He'd been doing television for decades. These appearances were second nature to him. But as he walked toward the stage, he noticed Jimmy Kimmel in the hallway, and the host's expression was anything but welcoming. "David," Jimmy said, his voice carrying an edge that immediately put Spade on alert. "Hey, Jimmy, how's it going?" David replied, maintaining his usual casual demeanor. Jimmy's eyes narrowed slightly. "We need to talk about your monologue from last week." David raised an eyebrow. He'd done a small set at the Comedy Store where he'd made a few jokes about late-night hosts, nothing particularly harsh, just the usual industry ribbing that comedians had been doing for decades. "What about it?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Jimmy said, his voice getting louder. "The bit about how some hosts are just failed comedians who got lucky with a time slot." David couldn't help but smirk. "Jimmy, come on. It was just a joke. You guys roast each other all the time. This is different, and you know it," Jimmy shot back, his face reddening. "You specifically mentioned my name, and you did it in front of industry people. That's not just comedy, that's career sabotage." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. David stared at his host, genuinely confused by the level of hostility he was encountering. "Jimmy, I've known you for years. Since when can't you take a joke? I've taken plenty from you and other hosts. It's part of the business." "Don't turn this around on me," Jimmy snapped, pointing a finger at David. "You crossed a line, and now you're going to go out there and pretend like nothing happened? Like you didn't try to humiliate me in front of my peers." David felt his own anger starting to rise. He'd come here as a favor to promote a project and provide some entertainment for Jimmy's audience. And instead, he was being ambushed by a host who apparently couldn't handle the same kind of humor he dished out nightly. "Look, if you're that upset about it, maybe we should just cancel the interview," David suggested, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Oh, no," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a sinister quality. "You're going out there, and you're going to explain yourself to my audience. You're going to apologize for what you said, and you're going to do it with a smile." The demand was so outrageous that David almost laughed. Almost, instead, he felt a cold realization wash over him. This wasn't about comedy or professional courtesy. This was about Jimmy Kimmel's ego and his inability to handle even the mildest criticism. "I'm not apologizing for doing comedy," David said firmly. "That's not how this works, Jimmy. You of all people should understand that." Jimmy's face contorted with rage. "Then you're going to have a very uncomfortable 10 minutes out there." Before David could respond, the same production assistant appeared, looking nervous. "Mr. Spade, we're ready for you." David looked at Jimmy one more time, seeing something in the host's eyes that he'd never noticed before. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel he thought he knew. This was someone drunk on power, someone who'd let the adoration of his audience convince him that he was above the very comedy community that had made him. "Fine," David said quietly. "Let's do this." As they walked toward the stage, David could hear the audience applauding, completely unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Jimmy plastered on his television smile, but David could see the malice lurking just beneath the surface. This wasn't going to be an interview, it was going to be an execution, and Jimmy Kimmel was ready to play executioner. The studio lights felt hotter than usual as David walked onto the stage, the audience's enthusiastic applause washing over him like a wave of false comfort. He knew that in a few minutes, many of these same people would be witnessing something they never expected to see on late-night television. Jimmy was already at his desk, that practiced smile firmly in place. But David could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed impatiently against his coffee mug. "Ladies and gentlemen, David Spade," Jimmy announced, his voice carrying its usual warmth for the cameras. Though David detected the underlying ice dot, David settled into the guest chair, offering a wave to the audience. He'd sat in this exact spot dozens of times before, but tonight it felt like sitting in an electric chair. The audience was still buzzing with excitement, completely oblivious to what was coming. "David, thanks for being here," Jimmy began, his media-trained smile never wavering. "How are you doing tonight?" "I'm doing great, Jimmy. Thanks for having me," David replied, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the knot forming in his stomach. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, and David recognized the pose. It was the same one Jimmy used when he was about to go in for the kill with a politician or someone he disagreed with. "So, David, I have to ask you about something. Last week you did a set at the Comedy Store, and you had some interesting things to say about late-night television." The audience murmured with curiosity, sensing that this wasn't going to be typical late-night banter. David felt every camera in the studio focused on him, waiting for his response. "Yeah, I do comedy, Jimmy. That's kind of my thing," David said, trying to keep it light, hoping against hope that Jimmy would back down. But Jimmy pressed forward, his smile becoming more predatory. "Right? But you specifically talked about late-night hosts being, and I quote, failed comedians who got lucky with a time slot. You mentioned me by name, David, in front of industry executives." The studio fell silent. Even the audience seemed to sense that something was wrong, that this wasn't the usual playful back and forth they were accustomed to seeing. David could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this very public confrontation. "Jimmy, come on," David said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Since when do we not joke about each other? You've made plenty of jokes about me over the years. This is different, and you know it," Jimmy shot back, his carefully constructed television persona beginning to crack. "There's a difference between friendly ribbing and what you did." "What you did was malicious." David stared at his host, genuinely shocked by the turn this interview had taken. "Malicious, Jimmy. It was a comedy bit. I wasn't trying to destroy your career. I was making jokes. That's what comedians do." The audience was completely silent now, sensing the real tension between the two men. Some people in the front rows were exchanging uncomfortable glances, clearly not sure if this was part of some elaborate bit or if they were witnessing an actual confrontation. Jimmy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You know what I think, David? I think you're jealous. I think you're bitter that your career peaked in the 90s, and you can't stand that guys like me have found success in a format you never could master." The accusation hit David like a physical blow. The sheer unprofessionalism of it, the calculated cruelty, left him momentarily speechless. He could hear a few gasps from the audience, people who couldn't believe what they were hearing. "Wow," David finally managed, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the studio. "Jimmy, I came here tonight as a friend, as someone who's known you for years, and this is what you do. You ambush me on your show because you can't handle a joke." Jimmy's mask was fully off now, his face flushed with anger and something else, something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "I'm not ambushing you, David. I'm giving you a chance to explain yourself, to apologize to me and to my audience. For what you said, apologize." David's voice rose slightly, his own anger finally breaking through. "Jimmy, you've built your entire career on making fun of people. You have a segment where you read mean tweets about celebrities. You mock politicians, actors, musicians, everyone. But I make one joke about late-night hosts, and suddenly I need to apologize." The audience was riveted now, watching this real-time destruction of what should have been a simple promotional interview. David could see people in the front row with their phones out, undoubtedly recording what was turning into a career-defining moment for both men. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, a move that was completely unprecedented in his show's format. "The difference, David, is that I punch up. I go after people who deserve it. What you did was punch down, and you did it behind my back." "Behind your back?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jimmy, it was a public comedy show. There were 200 people there. including half the comedy community in Los Angeles. If I wanted to talk behind your back, I wouldn't do it at the Comedy Store on a Saturday night. Jimmy walked around his desk, moving closer to David's chair, in what could only be described as an intimidation tactic. The cameras followed him, capturing every moment of this unprecedented breach of late-night television protocol. "You know what I think this is really about?" Jimmy said, his voice dropping. "To a more dangerous register, I think you're angry because guys like me took over. We adapted, we evolved, we found new ways to connect with audiences. Meanwhile, you're still doing the same snarky, bitter routine you were doing 25 years ago." The personal attack was so vicious, so calculated, that even the audience seemed to recoil. David sat in his chair, processing the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about a comedy bit. This was about Jimmy Kimmel's need to publicly humiliate him, to assert his dominance in front of his audience and the millions watching at home. "Jimmy," David said slowly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Around him, I've been nothing but supportive of you over the years. When you got this show, I was happy for you. When you had success, I celebrated it. And this is how you repay that friendship, by trying to destroy me on television because your ego can't handle a joke." Jimmy's face twisted with something ugly, something that revealed the true nature of what lay beneath his carefully crafted public image. "Don't lecture me about friendship, David. Friends don't try to sabotage each other's careers. I told a joke, Jimmy, one joke, and your response is to bring me on your show and try to humiliate me in front of millions of people. Who's really sabotaging who here?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Jimmy seemed to realize how far he'd gone, how completely he'd exposed himself. But instead of backing down, instead of trying to salvage the situation, he doubled down. "You want to know what this is really about, David?" Jimmy said, his voice now carrying a venom that shocked even the most seasoned audience members. "This is about respect, something you clearly don't understand anymore." David slowly stood up from his chair, matching Jimmy's aggressive posture. The physical dynamic had completely shifted, and the cameras captured every tense moment. "Respect? Jimmy, you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to humiliate me on national television because I made a joke. If anyone doesn't understand respect, it's you." The audience was completely silent now, some people visibly uncomfortable, others leaning forward with morbid fascination. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a public execution, disguised as a talk show interview. Jimmy stepped even closer, his face now red with rage. "You think you can just say whatever you want about people and hide behind the word comedy. That's not how the real world works, David. The real world." David's voice carried a note of incredulity. "Jimmy, we're comedians. Comedy is our real world. Making jokes about each other is what we do. But apparently you've been in this bubble so long, surrounded by yes men and audience applause, that you've forgotten what comedy actually is." The accusation clearly struck a nerve because Jimmy's composure completely shattered. "Don't you dare lecture me about comedy. I've been doing this longer than you think, and I've earned my place here. Earned it." David shot back his own anger, finally matching Jimmy's intensity. "Jimmy, you got this job because you were willing to play nice with the network executives. You earned it by being safe, by never taking real risks, by always punching down at easy targets instead of challenging anyone who actually matters." The studio fell dead silent. Even the crew members, who had seen countless interviews over the years, were stunned by the raw brutality of the exchange. Jimmy's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to rage to something that looked almost like panic. "Get him out of here!" Jimmy suddenly shouted, turning toward his producers. "I want him off my stage right now!" David stared at Jimmy in disbelief. "Are you serious? You're having me thrown off because I finally told you the truth about yourself." "Security," Jimmy yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "Get security up here now." The audience gasped audibly as two security guards appeared from the wings. Clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but following orders, David looked at them, then back at Jimmy, and shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable," David said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned studio. "Jimmy, I've known you for over a decade. I thought we were friends. I supported you. I defended you when other people in the industry said you weren't funny enough for this job. And this, is what our friendship means to you. The second your ego gets bruised, you have me physically removed from your show." Jimmy's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or adrenaline or the realization of what he'd done. "You brought this on yourself, David. You could have just apologized, but you had to make it worse." "Make it worse?" David laughed bitterly. "Jimmy, I told a joke at a comedy club. You turned it into this circus. You're the one who made it worse by bringing me here under false pretenses and trying to humiliate me on television." The security guards approached David cautiously, clearly hoping he would just leave voluntarily rather than forcing them to physically escort him out. David looked at them with something approaching pity. "Don't worry, guys," David said to the security guards. "I'm not going to make your jobs any harder than they already are." He turned back to Jimmy one final time. "But Jimmy, when you go home tonight and watch this back, when you see what you've become, I want you to remember that this isn't comedy, this isn't entertainment, this is just sad." Jimmy's face contorted with fury. "Get out of here, David." "Out of my studio, and don't come back." David nodded slowly, looking around the studio one last time. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them clearly disturbed by what they'd witnessed. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Jimmy's complete meltdown. "You know what the funny thing is, Jimmy?" David said as he started walking toward the exit. "The joke I told about late-night hosts getting lucky with their time slots, I was actually defending you guys. I was saying that it takes more than luck to succeed in this business. But watching you tonight, seeing how you handle the slightest bit of criticism, maybe I was wrong. Maybe some people really did just get lucky." Jimmy was practically vibrating with rage now. "Get him out of here. Get him out right now." As David reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the audience directly, "this is what happens when power goes to someone's head. When someone gets so used to being in control, so used to being the one asking the questions, that they can't handle being on the receiving end for even 5 minutes." Cut to commercial. Jimmy screamed at his director. "Cut to commercial, right now," but the cameras kept rolling, capturing Jimmy's complete loss of control. His desperate attempt to regain command of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage. David walked off the stage with dignity intact, leaving behind a host who had revealed his true nature to millions of viewers. The audience sat in stunned silence as David disappeared into the wings, many of them still processing what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel they thought they knew. This wasn't the affable, self-deprecating host they had come to expect. This was someone whose ego had grown so large, whose sense of self-importance had become so inflated, that he couldn't tolerate even the mildest criticism from a fellow comedian. As the security guards followed David backstage, Jimmy stood alone on his stage, facing an audience that now saw him in a completely different light. The mask had slipped, and there was no putting it back on. The silence in the studio was deafening, broken only by Jimmy's heavy breathing and the distant sound of David's footsteps as he left the building. His dignity intact while Jimmy's lay in ruins on the stage he had tried so hard to control. Well, there you have it, folks. A masterclass in how ego and power can corrupt even those we thought we could trust. What started as a simple comedy bit turned into a public humiliation, but not for the person Jimmy Kimmel intended. Make sure to subscribe for more stories like this and comment below with your thoughts. Do you think David Spade was right to stand his ground, or should he have just apologized and moved on? Let me know what you think.